Hi there, I'm Tiff. This is Tiff Reads Books, and this is a December wrap-up. I read 20 books last month, and Storygraph is down, so I have made you graphs. I've been extra, and I've used the data science that I use for work, and I have gone into a program called R, and I have made you graphs that I probably could have made in half the time on Canva, but I think they look nicer. So this is what we're going with. Oh, I hope you know that I did this for you. I spent all this time for you. This is the stack of physical books that I'm going to be talking about in this video, and the rest are going to be audio. So if you want to hear about these and not the stats, you can skip to this timestamp right here, and I will be done talking about the statistics at that timestamp, I promise. So, but for those of you who want the statistics, here they are. Overview is that, like I said, I read 20 books. Those were a portion of 75% audio and 25% physical. For the physical books, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because I can do math in my head, there were 2,034 pages between those 5 books. I didn't read anything digitally this month, but Audible books and Libby books were my audio, and I read 86.48 hours of audiobooks. So you can imagine that means there was a lot of short stories in there. These numbers are down from my previous months, but honestly, I'm okay with it with the stress that comes with the holidays. I really appreciate that for a lot of people, the holidays are joy and excitement and happiness, but for me, they are stress. So I'm very happy that they're over, and I can get back into my normal routines, because I kind of like my normal routines. So of those books, there was an average of 3.8 stars, which is also why I read less, is the books I was reading this month, I didn't have as many good ones, and that kind of put me off from consuming more. But that's okay, because this is still more books than I have read in the last, according to Goodreads, the last 4 years before 2023, so combined. Okay, so those are the overview stats. For the breakdown stats, I should have some pretty plots to put here for you. I'm gonna be really upset if I don't, because it means I put hours into it and I got nothing to show. So I'm gonna start with the genre breakdown. Out of the 20 books, half of them were fantasy. That's 10 fantasy books, and those were broken down into quite a few different genres. So a supernatural, one that was kind of like slipstream-ish, 2 romances, 1 paranormal, 1 magical realism, 2 horror, 1 historical fantasy, and 1 high fantasy. Then in the horror category, I had 1 supernatural and 1 paranormal. In the science fiction category, I had 3 which were dystopian, 3 which were crime procedurals, and 1 which was Afrofuturism. Then in the thriller genre, that was a crime procedural. These are my interpretations of subgenres, so other people might have different interpretations of them, but these are the ones that I use when I'm thinking about books. So they may be meaningless to you, but the overall genres, you can kind of take something from. So in terms of a series, 5 of the books that I read were part of a series, and then 1 book was a complete series, as well as a collection of short stories that Audible broke down into individuals, and those were like 7 books that were all actually 1 series. So I completed 2 like cohesive series, as well as read 5 books from a series. We're going to talk about author gender, and this is based on what people are willing to disclose. I haven't done extra research. It's just when you go to the author's Wikipedia page or their Instagram, if it says she, her, he, him, they, them, I've used those pronouns as gender, or whatever the author said about themselves on their author page on Goodreads or their author page on their personal website. So 10 of the authors identified as women, and 3 of those authors wrote the science fictions that I read, and the other 7 were fantasy. I read from 1 intersex author this month who did a science fiction and a fantasy book that I read, and then from authors that identify as men, I read 6 books. 3 of them were science fiction, 1 was a horror, 1 was a fantasy, and 1 was a thriller. So 1 from each of my genre categories this month, at least 1. And in terms of non-binary authors, I read 1 fantasy and 1 horror from a non-binary author. Let's get into the actual books. I'm going to start with the 1 temporary DNF. So The Left Hand of Darkness is a science fiction. It's considered one of the like kind of classics. I guess modern classics maybe is kind of how it's described. This is by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it is set in the future, like thousands of years in the future. And we're following our main character, who is kind of an envoy for a league of planets, and he is in the planet which they call Winter, but that's not the name of the planet. And the planet is populated by people who don't identify as either male or female. They are non-binary presenting, but also, from what it's described, intersex, because they can all reproduce with whichever one in the population. I'm not exactly sure in the details because I only got 50 pages in before I had to pause it. So our main character is from what is essentially Earth, and he is kind of uncomfortable with the way that these people are and trying to get used to them, and he's trying to get them to join the Federation of Planets to create trade routes. So, but he's living there, and this population of people are very much like against outsiders, and the king is a little mentally unstable. And that's kind of as far as I got. So I stopped on this because this is written in that era of fantasy and sci-fi that doesn't always work for me, where it is very exposition heavy and we get a lot of details of everything. And after reading something that I will talk about next, I just was so slumpy that I was struggling through this because of the pacing of the book itself. I do still really want to read this. I'm not putting it down forever. I'm just putting it down for now. The book that fucked me up was Iron Flame. And you can see my video on it. I had to break it down into 2 because it was so overwhelming for me. And I actually had to take a break completely of audiobooks for like a week just because I was so frustrated with that book, the repetitiveness. Briefly, it's the sequel to Fourth Wing. It picks up exactly where the last one left off. Definitely hard to talk about without spoiling the first one, though there are tons of spoiler videos on here, but I'm trying not to spoiler things in this video. Our main character, Violet, is determined to be a martyr in this book. So consistently she's doing the thing that I don't like, where she's like, nobody can help me, I have to do it all on my own. There's nobody, everything's my fault, everything's my fault, everything's my fault, everything's broken because of me, it's my fault. And I'm like, girl, other people have agency, okay? They chose what they chose. Stop it. And then the romance between the 2 main characters was just so toxic and annoying and juvenile, and honestly, I couldn't. And the first half, the book could have been 2 books, or it should have not even had the first half. Like, we could have worked all the elements into the second one, into the second half. The book was like almost 700 pages, and it did not need to be. So we're going back to the school, like, mild spoiler, we go back to the school, and it's just like repeating the first book over again. And there are so many repetitive statements in the way the book is done, that I've heard people suggested that she maybe wrote the book with AI, considering the fast turnaround. I don't know. I'm not going to judge. I will not be continuing this series. I just can't do it. It was so stressful. I did it because my boyfriend asked me to, because we read the first one on audio together, and it was fun to like talk about it and see our different points of view on it. And he thought I was maybe being a little bit harsh, so he was like, oh, are we going to listen to the second one? And then he's lucky I love him, because he did not continue. I did it, and now he hasn't. And he's like, well, you hated it so much, I don't know if I want to read it. I'm like, bro, I did that for you. So, my betrayal aside, yes, okay, so, hold on. Okay, dog problem sorted, hopefully, for now. So, Okay, this is going to be the issue, is making sure that I actually talk about every book. So that was my 1 star of the month. Okay. This book was a 2-star. I did not like it. I was so excited about it because it was supposed to be like dystopian and weird and lyrical, and it was, but it was also boring and fat phobic and like it had a lot of weird elements that I did not like in it. I have a vlog on why I didn't like it, but this was like my one disappointment of the vlog. I read it in like 3 or 4 hours because I just didn't like it at all. So, but I wanted to finish it. So we're following a group of kids who are on like a family vacation, like a multi-family vacation, and the parents are not so great. So the parents in this book are drinking and doing drugs every night while the kids are kind of left to like fend for themselves. Each of the parents has like their own room as a couple in this like cabin, and the kids are all confined to like a bunk. And so we get a lot of like the kids in like the little kind of games they've like invented to keep themselves busy and like what they're doing. And then all of a sudden like a climate catastrophe hits and shit goes down. So, and then it gets weird. Like we get like a survival story and an escape story, and we get hunted by rednecks, and it's just weird, and I was not a fan, and this is going in the donate pile. I got it, luckily. Okay, so I'll tell you where I got these books too, since we've talked about 2. These both came from my local thrift store. I paid $1 for each of them from my local thrift store. So this will be going back to that thrift store. From Audible, I got T. Kingfisher's Bryony and Roses, which is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I actually enjoyed it. It was like a 3.5 for me. We're following Bryony, who is a gardener. She just loves plants, and she and her sisters have been trying to make their own way in the world after their father passed. And she stumbles upon this magical manor that kind of pops out of nowhere in front of her, and it takes care of her, like gives her like food and a place for shelter for during this winter storm. And then when she goes to leave the next day, she tries to take a rose, and she's confronted by this beast who tells her that she now has to stay there with him. And he's nice and gives her a week to go back and tell her sisters, so that her sisters don't think she's died or disappeared, and explain to them, and then she has to come back. And if she doesn't come back in that week, the manor will bring her back. So as the story goes on, we get Bryony, who is, as T. Kingfisher likes to write, a very inquisitive and curious woman, and she decides she's going to figure out what is going on in this castle and why he's a beast and why the castle is able to just magically give her things when she asks for them. And the two, of course, because it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, fall in love. And we get some like fun Beauty and the Beastie scenes where we get, the library, but she's a gardener, so she's not as excited about the library. She's more excited about the garden she gets to make. And we just kind of get her trying to come to terms with the fact that she is a prisoner, but she also believes that the beast isn't what he seems to be, and the fact that he is a nice and kind captor. And it's just kind of nice and wholesome, and it has the weird T. Kingfisher horror elements that I love. And slowly falling as I talk, so I keep getting lower. We'll talk next, I guess, about the John Scalzi series I read. So I read the Dispatcher series on Audible. They're short 3 to 4 hour short stories that are all about this dispatcher called Tony Valdez, and Tony's job is to kill people for the government, because in the world that we're in, people who are murdered don't die. They reappear back in their home with their body in the state that it was 12 to 20 hours before. If people die of natural causes or an accident, they stay dead. So when we're introduced to Tony, he's in an operating room, and we're shown a scene where the patient is about to die on the operating table because of a reaction to the anesthetic or something like that. So we get Tomi basically killing them using medical means so that they reappear back in their home. Like, and not open-chested from the surgery. All their wounds are closed because they're reset to a previous state in time. As you can imagine, this has an effect on crime lords and billionaires. So, and millionaires, like very wealthy people, tend to use this to their advantage. So that's kind of where the crime procedural comes in. Tomi ends up linking up with a police officer and solving a crime together in the first book, the second book, and then the third book, he's kind of a little more on his own because the third book is set actually during the pandemic. So we are set in a timeline equivalent to ours. These were fine. They weren't anything super special. I might have even talked about them in my these are fine books. So yeah, they were okay. All right, let's talk about the Amazon collection Into Shadow. So the Into Shadow collection, I'm just gonna pull up all the books on Audible and go through them one by one. So I read these on Audible for the last weekend in the month. I needed something to listen to while I was doing chores and cleaning. I have a vlog, if you haven't watched it, where I talked about the first 3 a little more in depth than I did the last 4. Okay, so the first one is The Garden, and this is by Tomi Champion-Adeyemi. This was set in Latin America, and we were following a woman whose mother had passed, and she had her mother's journal, and it was talking about this place that her mother had gone to. And so our main character is going to that place. And it's told in like half poetry and half prose, and it was just not enough for me. I think it ended on too much of a cliffhanger, and I think in short stories it's really hard to end things on a cliffhanger satisfactorily. Like, I think novels, you could end a novel on a cliffhanger and it would be satisfactory, but it's really hard to do that in a short story. To me, this was only 45 minutes, so it was very quick. The prose was really beautiful, the poems were great, but it was a 3. The next one was Persephone by Lev Grossman, and we are following a young girl who has, like a high school girl who has a secret. Her dad told her that she was special and something would happen to her one day, and then that thing happens. And because it is a short story, I can't tell you anything else. And it was also mid. It was like a 3.5. It was fine. It wasn't anything super special. The main character kind of annoyed me a little bit, but it was fine. And then this one I loved. The 6 Deaths of the Saint it was amazing. We start off with a woman having a saint come to her and tell her that she's like going to do something or be something, and then she's brought to this like prince, and then we follow her kind of becoming a warrior for him, and then we get the supernatural aspect of it, and I really, really liked it. It was so good. It's told in second person for most of it, and so it's like you are asleep and you see this, and it was so good. It gave me goosebumps like through the whole thing. This is the first Alix E. Harrow book I've ever read or listened to, and I'm gonna check out more after this. Then there was What the Dead Know by Nghi. This was historical, kind of Victorian era supernatural fantasy. We are doing a seance. So Victorian era in the US was called the Gilded Age. So, but we are having a seance, and we are following 2 characters who lead seances and maybe are a little untruthful about it, but then something supernatural happens in the middle of the night after they get stuck at the place where they're doing the seance. So that one was pretty good. I like that one. I think that was like a 4 for me. I enjoyed it. My problem with it, I wanted it to be longer, and it could have been. It was 50 minutes. And the next one we're talking about is 2 hours. So it could have been just a little bit longer because the supernatural aspect of it wrapped up so quick. Like, we got the justification of what was happening so quick that I was like, no, I wanted a little bit more. Like, I needed a little bit more to like make it impactful. If it had just another 5, just 5, honestly, it would have been fine. Okay, and then Undercover is the Tamsyn Muir one. I loved this one as well. This one was 2 hours. This is the longest one in here, and I am so glad it was long. We are kind of fantasy, kind of science fiction on like a moving city, I think. Our woman who's interviewing for this mob boss is interviewing to be the bodyguard of a ghoul. And the ghouls in here are like transformed humans who start eating human flesh. So it has this horror element and the humanity in horror, and like the human element of this ghoul is like it. And then there's this twist reveal at the end that was just, Tamsyn Muir is my fucking queen, okay? Like, it was just so good. So good. And it is sapphic as well. Okay, so then we had The Candles Are Burning, which is by Veronica G. Henry, and this one is following a woman whose husband has died, and she has a special gift from her, like, passed down through her maternal line. She gets visions. She's like a seer. She gets visions of the future, but only of like dangerous future situations. The twist in there was really interesting. Very dark, very supernatural. I enjoyed it. That was like a 3.75. It was just on the cusp for me. I'll probably check out some more from this author. And then the last one was Out of the Mirror Darkness by Garth Nix. This is also a historical fiction, and we are following it's like the golden era of movies, like the 1940s, is that? I don't know. It's the beginning of Hollywood, essentially, and so we're following a movie studio who is using a couple of dogs on their set, and one of the dogs falls asleep and won't wake up, and we discover the reason for that, and it's kind of supernatural, eldritch horror-y, very eldritch horror-y actually. So that one was okay. I didn't like the character's POV that we were seeing the story through. I think if we saw it through a different character, I might have enjoyed it more. Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chupeco. I got this from my local library. So I've had it for a little while. It took me a bit to start it. It came in sooner than I expected, and I was in the middle of other things. So this took me like 2 weeks to read. But it was really good. So Rin Chupeco has become one of my favorite authors this year. I love everything that they do. I haven't given anything like a bad review that I've read from them. Rin Chupeco is a Chinese-Filipino author who lives in the Philippines currently. So we kind of get everything through that lens. And this is a vampire fantasy heavily inspired by Castlevania, apparently. I had never watched Castlevania until now, and now I am hooked. It is so bloody and gory, and this is so bloody and gory. Like, this is a fantasy horror. Like, we get, like, transformed vampires into these big, ugly mutants, and we get people ripping out entrails and all sorts of disgusting shit. We also get a really cute romance. So it's like this weird tonal shift. My main issue with this, so we're following Remy Pendergast, who is a vampire hunter. He is essentially our Travis Belmont. Okay? He has very similar dialogue, like patterns and rhythms of speech to Travis Belmont from what I've found, except for the fact that Remy is suspected to be a half vampire by the people of the town. And he ends up falling for 2 vampires, Xiaodon, Song Xiaodon and Zidane Malek. And they are the heiress to the 4th court and the leader of the 3rd court, respectively. Whichever court they are. Anyway, they're important in vampire world. Okay? So, there's currently trying to make an alliance between the kingdom that Remy lives in and the vampire courts, which also live mostly in the kingdom. Sometimes they live outside of it. Xiaodon's court is outside of it in a different province. We get a lot of talks about politics and colonialism, and more so in Court of Wanderers, which is the sequel that I read, and that will be that's in the vlog, but I'm going to do a wrap up at the end of the first week of January, and you'll get a wrap up of all the arcs that I've read, and I'm going to do wrap up every week of the arcs. So that was an arc. I read this so I could read the arc because I love the covers, okay? Like, this is all of my, like, this is all of my 2000s MySpace dreams. Like, that's what these colors are. So anyway, yeah, so very heavy on the politics, which I really like. My main reason for not liking this was Remy's character himself is his whole no one likes me, I don't deserve anything good was grating. It was grating. And I understand that this whole book takes place in the span of maybe a month, so he's not going to get a big character development just because some people fall in love with him. I understand that from a real world perspective, but from a book perspective, the constant assumption that he didn't deserve anything good constantly was driving me crazy. So that was honestly my main reason for not, but I think the more I think about it, because when people have too fast of a character development, I get frustrated. So had there been too much character development in this book, I would have probably been more frustrated with it. So, this is going to be a 4. We're going to bump it up to a 4. This is very, as I was watching Castlevania last night, I watched the first season over the weekend, and then last night we watched half of the second season. I was like, this artwork is like so inspired by it that I was like, wow. I'll talk about the other Rin Chupeco I read this month, which was an Audible book. It's The Sacrifice. This is set in the Philippines, and it is a YA horror. We are following Alan or Alwan. The audio narrator kept saying Alwan, but it's written Alan. So I don't know if that's because of how I had it sped up, but we are following Alwan, and they are a fisherman turned tour guide for this isolated island that is said to be cursed by the god's eye. And we have a film crew who is filming a ghost story, like one of those ghost investigator shows, and they decided they're going to do like 3 seasons of the show on this island. So they hire Alwan to be the tour guide for them and the interpreter of what is happening on the island, because Alwan knows it really well. And as things start unfolding with the curse, all of these shitty ass men start getting what they deserve. And I loved it for that. So the curse is weird and wild and twisty, and I didn't really expect it at the end. And for a YA horror, I thought it was pretty good. Again, a lot of conversations about colonialism and the exploitation of indigenous cultures for American media. And I really like that perspective that Rin Chupeco has. All right, I read 2 Stephen Kings this month. We'll just talk about them at the same time. They were both 4 to 4.5. Okay, so I read The Regulators this month. Man, I thought that was like November. I read The Regulators, and The Regulators is the sister book to Desperation, and we are following a group of people that live all on the same street in suburban Ohio, and suddenly things start getting really weird. It's a warm summer day, everyone's outside doing their things, and a van comes down the street and starts shooting people. Panic ensues, as you know, obviously you would do. And as people are trying to survive, we learn what is causing the violence and the bloodshed. And it's a very interesting conversation about that. So, it is weird. It is Eldritch horror-y. It has like vibes of, I don't know, Western. It has a Western undertone, which is why it's like partnered with Desperation. I honestly think if you read one, read the other. And I do think Desperation is probably the better one to read first, and then read The Regulators next. They both came out at the same time. The Regulators is technically Richard Bachman, it's Stephen King's pen name, and Desperation is Stephen King. So it's like the same, with some of the same characters, and it has one of my favorite female characters, but she's better in Desperation than she is in The Regulators. I read Holly. I think I have a whole video on Holly. So, but briefly, Holly this is her standalone book. She is a private investigator, and in this book is set during COVID. Her mother has just died, and in her grief, she's taken a case to find a missing woman, and she starts finding all these connections of other missing women and people and linking them together. And it's just kind of her dealing with processing the loss of her mother, who she had a tumultuous relationship with, and what that means for her, on top of coming into her own as a business owner and a detective, and a person who is dealing with generalized anxiety and potentially being another type of neurodivergent that's never really explained. But at this point, it's kind of like the culmination of her character. This is Stephen King's comfort character. So it was fine. It was a thriller. Yeah, it was okay. No supernatural elements for once for Stephen King. Let's talk about River Solomon. Okay, so I found River Solomon this month. I listened to An Unkindness of Ghosts. It was offered for free on Amazon, on Audible, and it had some really good reviews. So I was like, you know what? Let's try some sci-fi. And River Solomon has a very interesting perspective on gender and gender roles, and the history of enslavement of African people, and bringing that all into a sci-fi dystopian book about colonialism, where everyone is living like in a spaceship that's looking for a new planet to colonize because they had destroyed Earth, was so good and so dark. We're following Aster, who is a doctor, well, an assistant to the doctor. But because everyone on the lower levels of the ship is enslaved, they don't have access to the doctor. They have Aster. And so she does everything that she can to protect and help out the people that are on the lower decks of the ship with her, often to her own detriment, because she doesn't really care that she's putting herself in harm's way, because she's doing it for everyone else. Aster also is neurodivergent, as is River Solomon, so it's an own voices on processing things differently than the mainstream voices of people. And I really enjoyed all of it, even though it was dark and depressing and it destroyed my soul. But it was so good. It was one of those like beautiful tragedies that I just, the relationships that we have between Aster and the other women on her decks, we talk a lot about friendships and friendships and romantic relationships and mother-daughter relationships and what those all mean in different aspects of society. And I really enjoyed the conversations of it, and the story as well is really beautifully written. So because of that, I was like, let me find another one. And The Deep was recommended to me on Audible, but it was not free. So I went to Libby and I got it from Libby, and it was a 4-hour book that I listened to in 2 hours. And the audiobook called me out at the end. And it was like, this is a short book and you listened to it on double speed, didn't you? And I was like, I did. But this follows a mermaid whose name I can't remember because I listened to it fast. She is the historian for her kind. And the way that the mermaids work is they have one historian who remembers all of their history from the very beginning. And they once a year come together and share the stories, and then everyone else gets to forget them except for the historian. And we talk about the toll that mental load takes on her, and she ends up fleeing. And then as she flees, we get the history of the mermaids told to us. And it is essentially women who were thrown over slave ships and what happened to their babies that they were pregnant with at the time. And so we get, again, a conversation about the history of slavery in the United States. And then also another conversation, again, about sex and gender and sexuality and how that all plays into society and how those are socially constructed differently in different cultures. And I absolutely loved it. It made me cry. It was so good. That was a 5 for me. Definitely recommend that one. All right. 2 more books left, and I'm sorry that I've talked for so long. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. 2 books left, and they are both sci-fi. So I'll talk about this one first. This is Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich, and I have talked to so many people about this one this month. This follows our main character, Cedar. Our main character, Cedar, who is adopted by a white family in the Midwest. She, in the beginning of the book, has discovered who her indigenous parents are, and goes up to the reservation to find them, to see her family. And while she's doing this, there's this background of some sort of disaster happening, and that disaster ends up leading to the fact that they are kidnapping pregnant women, because there is an issue with women actually giving birth to live children. And Cedar is pregnant in the beginning of this book, and we follow her writing a journal to her unborn child about everything that is happening. And we get this horrible scene of a woman being abducted because she's pregnant and taken by the government. And then we get Cedar trying to hide from the government. And it's just a tale of her like running because she's pregnant, and being pregnant and dealing with all of that when supplies are hard to get and everything is just crashing down. And we get like a suburban church deciding they're going to make their own government and make their own rules, and trying to kidnap her. And then we get the tribe. She like goes up to the reservation, and because the tribe is sovereign, they're like using their sovereignty to try to protect her and trying to defend all of the women in their tribe against the US government. And it was devastating and heartbreaking and tense and horrific. And I recommend it. Last one is Binti. This is by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a collection of the trilogy. Oh, this is another thrift store one. This was a $2 thrift store find. I got this one at Half Price Books, used. So this is a collection of the 3 Binti stories plus a new one that was written just for this. And Binti is Afrofuturism. We are following Binti, our main character, as she decides to leave her home and go to university. And the university is actually a whole planet. And she's been accepted. She's the only one from her culture to ever be accepted to the university. And she goes. And on her way there, the ship that she's on is attacked by a jellyfish-like race. And she ends up being a translator for them and forming an unlikely, stressful friendship with one of the jellyfish. They're called Medusae. Yeah, so it is interesting. There's a lot of heavy conversation in here on... Nnedi Okorafor does a lot of conversations on sexism and very intense sexism in the books that I've read from her. And this sexism and gender roles and racism and classism and colorism and how we interpret that in a university setting, and as well as in a cultural setting, and what it means to try to break those norms and those expectations. So this one was really good. I read it really quick. It's pretty YA as far as the reading level of it, but the story itself is actually really good. I liked this more than I liked Who Fears Death. I think I gave this a 4.5. Overall. There was also a random conversation about gender identity in here as well. So hard recommend. That was the chaotic wrap-up of all the books I read this month, and I'm going to be back again with my TBR for January. So I'll see you soon. If you liked this, please like it. It definitely helps me.